Mhm.
Okay, let me introduce Peter. He received his education at the University of Aarhus and is currently professor at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, well known for its open-minded economics department. He has written an impressive number of articles, mostly on macroeconomic topics from a Keynesian or post-Keynesian perspective. He has also written two books, one of which is on Nicholas Calder, which I found coincidentally to be one of my countrymen. Peter has spread knowledge around the globe from England to Lithuania, from Bogota to Sao Paulo. So we are fortunate to have him with us today to discuss the issue of secular stagnation, which, as we know, is a very important topic with a longer history that was resurrected in 2013 by Larry Summers at a lecture at the IMF and has created quite a stir since then. I looked up some citations from the last couple of years, and they're incredible literature on the topic. So, without further delay, let me transfer the word to Peter. Thank you for being here. Nice to meet you, and the microphone is all yours.
Yeah. Thanks, John. I did I choose this topic? I guess I did, but Manfred sort of helped me. He suggested that since most in the audience were not sort of macro people, it might be good to do something relatively broad and something that might have more general interest. So I'll be talking about secular stagnation and fiscal policy. And just to sort of motivate a little bit, let me note both an empirical and a kind of theoretical whatever episode. I mean, you have Japan, which from 1945 to 1970 drew at rates per capita GDP of 8.2%. And then if you look at the period from 1990 to 2020, that dropped to 0.8%. So a very dramatic change in the growth performance of this quite important economy. And of course, a case that has been discussed widely and with very different views on what's been going on. Then you had another sort of more academic and policy-oriented episode where Reinhard and Rogoff, in a very prominent paper back in 2010, talked about how there was a fiscal cliff. A fiscal cliff once debt to GDP ratios rose above 90%, then they saw in the data a very significant decline in growth that was associated, they said, with a decline in the growth rate of GDP of about 4%, which of course is huge as an annual growth rate. So this very dangerous cliff, if you allow debt to rise too much, then there will be severe consequences. And so we have these observations, both of very dramatic changes in growth performance, and also these claims that gained a lot of prominence of the devastating consequences of a rise in debt. And of course, in Japan, debt did rise significantly from around 40% in 1990 to more than 200% by now. So that's sort of just by way of motivation. So what I want to talk about is that if you look at mature economies, and that's the term that I've been using, and I think at least Caldo used it. I don't know. Some people use it. A mature economy, in my terminology, is an economy that is fluctuating close to something like full employment. It's hard to define full employment. I don't want to go into that, but it's an economy that does not have huge amounts of hidden unemployment. By that standard, Japan today is a mature economy. I think Germany is a mature economy. I think even the US may be a mature economy, although actually a case could be made, but maybe it's not quite as mature as it may seem. But close to full employment. And in close to full employment economies that grow along that kind of trajectory, you can have structural aggregate demand problems, which is the term that I sometimes prefer to use instead of secular stagnation. Secular stagnation is sometimes used just as growth has slowed down. The way I think it was used originally by Hansen, and the way I want to use it, is that it's associated with these structural aggregate demand problems in mature economies. I'll try to illustrate that first with some simple algebra. And once I've done that, I'll talk a bit about theory. How do we, in a sense, close this model? The accounting is relatively simple. So how do we close the model, and what are the implications of different ways of closing it? The main emphasis will be on functional finance, a term that also has a long history. After having closed it and outlined functional finance, Lerner's concept, I'll discuss some of the implications. I'll talk in particular, that'll be most of it, about growth and debt, and then also a little bit about the empirical relevance of functional finance, and a couple of comments on this rediscovery of secular stagnation by some Summers and other well-known economists. Krugman had been writing something similar, not using the term before that. Then I hope to say a little bit about how dual economies, the policy problems are quite different. And I think it's a distinction that's often forgotten, that not all economies are mature, not all of them are kind of fluctuating close to some kind of full employment ceiling. And if you're not doing that, then you will not have the same kind of structural aggregate demand problem. The problem is quite different. And that feeds into also the kind of policies that you may want to pursue. I want to then return briefly to Japan, which I used to motivate, and I'm going to provide my take on Japanese growth and stagnation. Try to interpret that using the framework that I have outlined. And then I'll have some concluding remarks, and I'll probably keep them very short. I had thought originally that we might say a little bit about austerity policies in the EU, but that's kind of opening up a lot of different topics as well. And in particular, because what I will be talking about here is mainly aimed at closed economies. Things can look very different if you have very open economies. And even more important, you want to have economies whose debt, where the public debt is issued in a currency that the country controls, its own sovereign currency. If you have debt issued in a foreign currency, or as in the case with Greece, a currency that it does not control, it cannot just print euros, then some of the policy issues are very, very different. So all of my discussion, and that's an important caveat, all of my discussion really is about countries with foreign debt issued in their own currency. It's also economies that are not too open. Once you're very open, there are other complications that we should address, and I'm not going to deal with that at all today. The talk will draw on a chapter in a book that should be coming out this spring, I hope and expect. But it does draw on a lot of earlier work and some of it actually going back quite a way. I did something on the Japanese growth and stagnation with a Japanese co-author back in 2007. Soon Ryu has been a co-author on several papers. I'll list one of them here, where we discuss these issues, and in some of these papers do it in models that are more complicated and perhaps more satisfactory. And then the dual economy stuff, a couple of papers are more recent, and one of them is listed here. I should mention also that since you're at Munich, and since he wrote this very wonderful paper, Egerhard Schlicht, in 2006, and his basic framework there is in some ways similar to what I'm doing in this talk. There are differences, and I do other things, but this was a great paper, I thought. Okay, let me get started. And first, some very simple algebra for a mature economy. So start with the goods market equilibrium condition. It's a closed economy, so just C and I and G as the three components of GDP. I've scaled it here with the capital stock, and the obvious reason for doing that is that what I want to talk about is not short run problems. It's long run. It's long run problems. It's the need for long run fiscal policy. And so I'm going to do that as an approximation by looking at steady growth paths. And so some of these ratios will be constant, and it's just convenient to do this scaling. Okay, government consumption. Controversial. How much should governments do? How involved should they be? Should we have healthcare through the public sector or whatnot? Very contentious, but I'm not going to get into that. Those issues are, in a sense, orthogonal to the pure aggregate demand issues. We don't want to decide how many police officers to have based on how we need to stimulate or contract aggregate demand. So I'll take the size of the public sector as being given. We've had that debate, it's been decided. So the ratio of G to K is simply gamma. Steady growth with full employment, as I mentioned, it's long run, and you look at steady growth paths as an approximation to this. And if we have a steady growth path, and if we have a mature economy where the labor force and employment grow at a rate N, and this is equal to, this is the labor force in effective units, so taking into account labor saving technical change. If that is equal to the growth rate of output, which is equal to, in steady growth, to the growth rate of a capital stock, then I over K is equal to N plus delta, where delta is the rate of depreciation. This is simple accounting. Then there may be a choice of technique. The output capital ratio along my steady growth path may or may not depend on the interest rate. Of course, that plays a prominent role in neoclassical growth models, the solar model, and I'll talk very briefly about that. I don't need any dependence for what I'm doing, and I don't need this this dependence to be as smooth and regular as assumed in a neoclassical production function. The Cambridge Capital controversy highlighted how there's no need for that to be a smooth relationship. It could even take perverse forms. We don't need to have the derivative here positive, even if it is differentiable. You can have capital reswitching and reversing. I don't need to talk about that really, but I'll allow for it, and my story is perfectly compatible, if you want, with the Cobb-Douglas production function. Okay, having made these assumptions, we can now look at the steady growth story and say, what is the required consumption to capital ratio? Gamma we fixed exogenously. This was by accounting. That's the investment to capital ratio, and we have, in one way or another, we have settled on sigma. Sigma is my I don't think I gave the notation, is my notation for the output capital ratio. If these are given, what needs to happen to the consumption to capital ratio? And we can ask, is this condition satisfied automatically? If it is happening partly through the endogenous changes in the output capital ratio, you can ask, is the capital intensity going to be optimal? Is that the one we want to have? And we can ask more generally, what determines the consumption to capital ratio? What are the answers? Well, we all know the Solow answer. Solow assumed in his paper that we'll be always at full employment. That's an assumption. He's quite explicit. Solow's original paper I actually like. I think it's good. It's limited, but he's quite explicit about leaving out a lot of stuff and about what his exercise is doing and not doing. He could have emphasized it more than he did, but it's there. So you have an assumption of full employment, and you have an assumption of a smooth production function, and you have sigma adjusting along this smooth production function so that you get to a long run steady growth path with a constant capital labor ratio.
Peter, may I interrupt for a second, because you said a lot in that first slide, and I find it problematic, honestly, that capital is such an ambiguous concept nowadays, because it includes human capital and all sorts of unmeasurables. So I find even that first equation very problematic. We don't know what the capital stock is.
I mean, I both agree and disagree with you. I agree with you in that certainly when we measure capital, there are all kinds of problems. Human capital is not included in my capital stock, I would say here.
But that's a major part.
That doesn't solve the issue. However, if you're doing long run growth, and if you're talking about investment, I don't understand how one can do that without saying investment is meant for something. The only reason people invest is that they expect that somehow that'll enable you to
well,
make
of course,
profit,
yeah. I went to the university and got a degree. That's an investment, but it's hard to know at an aggregate level how much that counts.
Human capital is not included in my notion of capital here. The human capital
you can't just exclude that. That's a major segment today.
I can exclude it from this because the human capital, a large part of that, is really included. All not all. In many countries, the primary education and also secondary education, and in some cases also university education and higher education, is really financed by the public. You can say that people who want to take this education, they invest their time and all that. I'm not really. I would see that as that's household decisions. That for right now, I'm not. That's not what I'm dealing with here. I appreciate that. Yes, capital is hard to define. But if I want to talk long-run growth trajectories, to do that without talking about scaling these variables and scaling them with something like a capital stock is going to be very, very difficult. Not to say impossible. That's my take. Can I suggest we return to it at the end?
Yeah, but I have another.
Talk long-run growth, and then we can go home early. But if I want to talk secular stagnation, I kind of need to. I will need it, and you can then. So come back and tell me that my analysis is irrelevant or whatever later on. If we can do it like that.
All right, sure.
So the Solow answer, The current sort of mainstream macro answer is a little bit different. It typically includes nice neoclassical production functions in their models, but in fact they don't need them. You could have a Leontief production function with a fixed technology, and the Ramsey DSGE models would still work, because you have the consumption behavior adjusting endogenously through the optimization of this centrally placed household that just optimizes it over an infinite horizon. So the DSGE model has the implication, or the Ramsey model has the implication that yes, the condition will be satisfied, and yes, the capital intensity will be optimal, because basically, if we use the utility function of this optimizing agent as our criterion, then yes, it has been optimized. It also has the implication that if we have fiscal policy, it doesn't actually have any effect as long as it's lump sum taxes. So the main implication of taxation is that it might distort. If it's not lump sum taxation, it might distort decisions. But basically, fiscal policy, aggregate demand policy, is both unnecessary, and it would, if people tried to use it, it would be ineffective. Okay, that is an exception, though, I hasten to say. I've forgotten whether I have a slide towards the end where I emphasize that, but let me say it now, that this Ramsey answer is an exception. Pretty much any other theoretical framework you can think of, including overlapping generations model, neoclassical OLG models, will have the implication that you may end up with capital intensities that are not desirable, and that fiscal policy will have an effect, will influence the outcome. So the Ramsey infinite horizon optimization model is an exception in this respect. The functional finance tradition, Abba Lerner coined the term, is Keynesian in its origin. It does not believe that you automatically have full employment. You need policy potentially to intervene and maintain full employment. So what should be done? What should be the criteria? Well, you adjust total spending, and that includes government spending. So here's a fiscal component. And you do that to eliminate unemployment and to eliminate inflation. So you want to get to full employment, assuming it's well defined, but you don't want to overheat, so you don't want to create inflation. But that's not all you want. You also want to achieve a desirable level of investment. You want to have the division between consumption and investment being appropriate. And to do that, you need to engage in monetary policy to get an interest rate that is appropriate that'll give you this split between consumption and investment. That'll induce the right amount on investment. This, of course, is labeled or phrased here, and that's what Lerner does, as a short run requirement. But it's relatively easy if you have output at full employment and you have a well-defined desirable level of investment. That means you have a desirable share of investment in income, which of course you can write as I over K times K over Y. So if this has a well-defined desirable ratio, if this here is determined by full employment, and therefore how much we need to have the capital stock growing, then that defines a desirable capital intensity. We want to have capital intensity that's appropriate, and that's basically what our choice of interest rate does. Choose the interest rate, and if we have a choice of technique, that's going back to what I talked about earlier. If the choice of technique is determined by factor prices, then basically once you've fixed the one of these, then you pin down the choice of technique. So this is the learner functional finance, and in some ways, it's actually in spirit very similar to the way people have been talking about monetary policy for many years, right? You have some utility function or cost function that central banks are supposed to optimize, and that includes inflation, it includes real output or employment, and then we pick an optimal monetary policy. Essentially, it's sort of the same thing Lerner is saying, right? Pick policy to achieve the goals that we care about. Where it sort of differs a little bit is the underlying understanding that we may need fiscal policy to contribute here, that we cannot just have monetary policy. Essentially, we have several targets, both an optimal capital intensity, which ties down monetary policy, and an employment target, full employment, and we need, that's the Keynesian element, we may need an additional tool, instrument to deal with that. So this is it. I'm just, I guess, restating what I've said already. Monetary policy to get the optimal capital intensity, and then fiscal policy to maintain full employment. Once we've done that, you can then ask the question, what are the implications of these policies for taxes and public debt? They now evolve. They were not targets in themselves. Debt or deficit surpluses are not intrinsically good or bad. We don't really care. What we care about is employment and inflation. We don't want to overheat, and we don't want to have a lot of idle resources. And we'll then use our instruments to achieve those targets. That's the philosophy behind it. So let me now return to the sort of simple equations that I started with, and let me give you a specific consumption function. This is very simple. It's in the spirit of similar to old Keynesian consumption functions. You have consumption depending on disposable income and depending on wealth, which for simplicity here, and that's actually another shortcoming, but another paper with Soon Ryu, we do it differently and better, I think. Here I'll assume that that wealth consists of the physical capital stock and then holdings of government bonds. Of course, people in advanced Western economies do not own wealth in the form of just fixed capital goods. The wealth primarily takes the form of financial assets of one kind or another, and these stocks and other financial assets can have capital gains and losses, and we may not have a Tobin's Q equal to 1 all the time, right? So really one should have a different specifications of wealth. I'll go with this because it's so much simpler, and I will claim, I'll tell you that this, what I've done with Soon Ryu, I mean, we get essentially the same results. I will go with not the specification that I actually use in the book chapter. I'll assume that it's all of disposable income that influences consumption, and not just wages and salaries, which is another way of specifying it, and that's what I do in the book. This here is simpler, and I think actually some traditional Keynesian models use this specification. Others go with just salary income, wage and salary income, labor income, and then have, in a sense, profits coming in through the wealth effect. So this is the consumption function I'll be using here. Then there's the government budget constraint, which is again simple accounting. You have the primary deficit here, and then you have the the interest on bonds. Let me say, I mean, I'm assuming throughout, I don't know, I mentioned this, that we have a steady growth path, and when we are preventing inflation, so capital prices are fixed, so everything is in real or nominal, whichever you want. The two things are the same. So I don't need to talk about real and nominal interest rates. You could add that in, and it would just be more notation, and again, not really change anything. So you have a consumption function now. You have the government budget deficit, and what you do now is that you will use your fiscal policy, and that essentially means your taxes, in order to maintain full employment growth. We pin down monetary policy, the interest rate, in order to get the appropriate choice of technique. So formally, here's my consumption function. Again, I just scaled it with the capital stock, and that's what it looks like. This is what I needed to achieve. I have now fixed my sigma, whatever we decide is the optimal capital intensity. We don't want to get into dynamic inefficiencies where we have too much capital, and we may want to not have something that's too low capital intensity either. Whatever has been decided socially as the optimal is what we are aiming for. These two need to be consistent, and you have this one variable here which you can solve for, and you'll get an expression for what taxes need to be. Once you have that, you can substitute into the debt dynamics. My lowercase b is government debt as a ratio to capital. And if you do that, you will get this expression for the debt capital ratio. Since you have a constant output capital ratio by assumption in the steady growth path, that is equivalent to having an equation for the debt GDP ratio. It's just they differ by just a constant scalar factor. Now, if you look at this relation, this is a nice one-dimensional differential equation. These are all constants. Here we have the level of B, and it's multiplied by this constant, so negative in front of it. So what you have is a one-dimensional system, downward sloping. You get a nice stable solution. You get B, the ratio, converging to some steady growth value for the debt GDP ratio. The applications, I've just written that here. Why is it stable? Why do we get this unambiguously stable? There's no sustainability issue. You don't have debt output ratio going to infinity or going to minus infinity. It converges to a constant. So there's certainly no extreme unsustainability problems. Why is it? Well, if you think of an increase in public debt, what does that do? Well, an increase in public debt, if B goes up, then you get higher disposable income, right? So people would tend to consume more, but we need to maintain consumption at the old level, because otherwise we'd be overheating the economy. So we have to respond by raising taxes. And in fact, we have to respond at least enough to prevent disposable income from going up, which means we need to actually take back whatever is paid out in interest has to be taken back in taxes. But we need to take back more than that, because wealth has also been going up, and we need to compensate for that. So we'll need to actually, as debt goes up, we have to raise taxes, not just to claw back the interest payments, but to claw back more, which means that, of course, the deficits decline, and we will get a reduction in the growth rate of the debt ratio. And then in addition to that, of course, if the economy is growing at a constant rate, there's some dilution of the debt simply because the denominator increases, and that also helps to stabilize the system. So that's why we get fairly intuitive and also fairly robust, although even talking about it here, one should be aware that some of this depends, some of these strong unambiguous effects depend on the way that I specified taxes as applying to, in a sense, disposable income and having the same effect on spending as other changes in disposable income. If you have different types of income being taxed differently, then all of a sudden you can get various distributional effects, and I don't want to go into that here. People have been talking about debt sustainability as a serious problem. So why doesn't it become a serious problem here? Why does it converge to a steady growth path? Well, I think part of it is that these exercises, when they're conducted, they often say, okay, let's imagine that we have a government that maintains a primary deficit of 3% of GDP forever. What would happen? And of course, if you impose this kind of arbitrary fiscal policy with some arbitrary deficit that's just pursued forever, no matter what happens, you can get crazy outcomes. Crazy or arbitrary policies can have bad outcomes. That's not surprising. Crazy monetary policies, imagine you have a central bank just fixing a nominal interest rate and keeping it there forever, no matter what. Would we be surprised if there could be crazy outcomes coming out of that? Undesirable outcomes? Of course not. And it's sort of the same here. Fiscal policies should not be conducted in that way. You want to adjust aggregate demand policy in light of the state of the economy. And if you do that, then you don't get those unsustainability problems. Another issue that's sort of an aside goes back to a comment I made early on, is that sometimes the discussion of debt sustainability seems to assume that the criteria would be the same in all countries, which I think is just pretty mind-blowing how anyone could make that claim. U.S. debt is very different from Greek debt. As I mentioned, Greek does not control the euro, it's euro. Greek can be forced into a default. It may not be able to pay the euros. The US cannot be forced into a default. They may choose. The US may choose to default if they can't raise the debt ceiling next month or whatever. But they cannot be forced to do it. They can print the bloody dollars if people want their dollars. Very different. And it seems that the literature, I mean, one example of that is a paper, recent paper by Collard and some co-authors in the Journal of the European Economic Association. Recent, it's not that recent now, I guess it's from 2015, where they seem to apply the same criteria to Greece and the US. The Wiesheimer calculation, Chalk has a paper in the Journal of Monetary Economics where he does exactly that, just arbitrary deficits, and he goes through the implications of it. Then turning to Reinhard and Rogoff, the claim in 2010 that if you have the debt to GDP over 90%, then mean levels of growth almost 4% lower. And as I mentioned, very influential paper, Olli Rehn here from European Commission, there were American politicians citing it as well. Olli Rehn saying serious academic research, if you're above 90%, then so this influenced a lot of the European policies. I think at least it was used as an excuse for the European policies. Of course, and that was a lot of fun for me because a student at UMass, Herndon, looked at the data. When he finally managed to get the data that Weinhardt and Rogoff had used, he discovered that there were basic spreadsheet errors. They'd forgotten a column, and they did other. I mean, it was just pretty bad. And once you correct it, then it turned out there was no threshold. It was not that you had this kind of situation, that when the capital output ratio reached 90%, then the growth rate would drop like this. Instead, it was more like this. There was still some negative correlation there, but there was no cliff. And of course, that was important at the time because if you're in the midst of a recession, then to say, oh, we have to cut spending right now because we're close to the cliff, that makes no sense. If there's no cliff, then you could say, okay, let's do it later. Right now, we need to deal with the unemployment that's mounting and the recession we're in. But the real question is about causation. If there is this mild but negative correlation in the data, then if we're talking long run negative correlation, that could be important, even if it's relatively mild. And it could be that yes, high debt has a serious cost. But of course, just seeing a correlation does not prove causation. And some of my colleagues, again, as well as others, tried to look at this econometrically, and they sort of concluded that the causation seemed to go the other way from growth to debt. I like the conclusion, but I have to say I was not deeply convinced by these econometric exercises, because I mean, Granger causality, something happening before something else, does not really prove long-run causal change. I mean, it's not surprising that if we have a downturn, then tax revenues fall, and we'll see a rise in debt. So the fact that there's this sort of short-run temporal pattern, it does not really establish that the long-run relation between economic growth and debt, that there's a causation running from growth to debt, and that there's no causation running the other way. So I have a little bit of doubt about these econometric exercise, and that's where, in some sense, I think theory, and in this case the model, at least has an answer. You may not like the model, you may feel that I miss important things or whatever, but the model unambiguously tells something about causation. In the model, I took the growth rate as exogenous. And then from that, I could derive what is happening to be. What is the long run outcome for the debt capital ratio if you change the growth rate? N was exogenous, B was endogenous. Causation was clear. So if you look at the comparative statics, we can do that. We had the debt capital ratio converging to this. I was just solving from the simple differential equation I gave you earlier. And if you look at that, you will find that the growth rate appears two places. It appears negatively in the numerator and positive in denominator. So unambiguously, the debt ratio depends inversely on the growth rate. I call it the natural growth rate. That's Harrow's term. The natural growth rate is the growth rate of the labor force in effective units. Causation here is clear, and it gives precisely the pattern that we observe in the data. Before talking more about that, let me also note something that I may not have time to talk about a lot, namely that if you look at government consumption, that appears in the numerator. That was my gamma, the ratio of G to K. If that goes up, the debt ratio goes down. That's paradoxical, at least from an immediate perspective. Hey, we spend more, we expand government spending, and as a result, we get lower debt in the future. The long run debt ratio gets smaller. It depends, not surprisingly, on the saving rate. If the saving rate goes up, then that reduces aggregate demand, and we need to stimulate the economy. That's going to raise the debt ratio. And of course, it also depends on the output capital ratio in ways that are not surprising. If the output capital ratio goes up, so we have less capital intensive technology, then we'll need less investment to grow at a constant rate. And that means that we need to boost consumption, and that's what's happening. When you have these kinds of simple results, unambiguous results, it's useful to think a little bit more about the mechanisms. And I guess I have talked somewhat about them, but let me flesh some of it out a bit more. It's useful because that can give you an idea of how robust these conclusions might be. And I will tell you that they are very robust. We found, Soon Ryu and I found them in OLG models. We found them in simple traditional Keynesian models. We found it in stock flow consistent post-Keynesian models. They don't hold in Ramsey models, as I said. That's an outlier. But they are quite robust once you leave that simple and, to my mind, pretty silly set of models. So why do you get them? What is the intuition? Why do you get these results? Well, if you think of an increase in the growth rate of the economy, or an increase in government consumption as a ratio to capital or to GDP, then what does that do? Well, that means that you get an increase in demand. Government consumption goes up. If you need to maintain a given level of aggregate demand, that means you need to reduce private consumption. If growth rate goes up, you need more investment. What does that mean? It means you need to reduce private consumption. So in both cases, you need to increase taxes. And of course, when you increase taxes, then that would tend to reduce your deficits and reduce the growth of debt. You could say, well, but we raised government consumption, so government consumption and tax goes up, but taxes goes up. It's not clear which goes up by more, but in fact it is. That's the balanced budget multiplier. If you have households saving part of their increase in disposable income, then you would need to increase taxes by more than you increased government spending. So those are the simple stories behind it, and they're quite intuitive, I think. And the very intuition behind them makes it also relatively clear that they're somewhat robust. Yeah. Okay, the rest are not important. Yeah, and this is just what I told you, that they're robust across different models. The exception is the Ramsey DSGE model. Let me make a comment here on the whole literature surrounding the sort of debt obsession and this claim that we need to take debt as a very serious problem and we need to reduce public debt. The first paradox is that these claims and this obsession occurred in a period when the Ramsey optimization as the core of DSGE models was the absolute dominating theoretical tradition. And in that tradition, debt is largely irrelevant. So it's not as if there was this strong theoretical justification for focusing on debt. Tax distortions and tax smoothing would be the two only reasons, the sustainability is not really something that would find a place in this framework. The second paradox is that most of the claims about these horrors of debt, public debt, were based on something that is very primitive correlation analysis. The Reinhard Rogoff basically taking two variables and say they're correlated, and then sort of jumping in interviews, they themselves jumped to this, but also suddenly it was read by politicians and journalists as there's a causal link. And that was part of a more general trend. I mean, they had this big fat book where they looked at financial crisis over 800 years and again looked at just correlation as if all of these episodes were kind of the same mechanism. That is paradoxical because the previous 30, 40 years, everybody had been talking about the Lucas critique and how we could not trust simple correlations. The Keynesian models were faulty because they just took these correlations and assumed they would exist in the future as well. Here we get something that is very crude empirics correlation, and the profession comes out with very strong conclusions, policy recommendations based on that. These reduced form interpretations, if you start asking simple questions, it sort of seems that they have to collapse, right? Do we really believe that the effect on growth is independent on the source of increasing debt? Even if we think debt might have an effect, is it independent on how this debt, why it was increased? Does it matter, for instance, whether the government has increased debt in order to boost investment in human capital, to go back to John's example? Does it matter whether the debt is boosted through this or that tax rate? Would we expect all of them to be the same? Should we expect a robust reduced form correlation? Think also balanced budget multiplier. We can have both taxes and debt go up and nothing happens to debt. Is that neutral? In fact, even Reinhard and Rogoff sort of touch on this when they say, "Oh, war debt is okay because wars come to an end, and then the debt problem will disappear afterwards." But of course, a Keynesian, as my friend colleague Tom Michael pointed out, their quote could easily be just turned around and said, "Well, high recession time government spending, as opposed to high war spending, typically the course of debt buildup comes to a natural close as growth returns, so don't worry about it." Okay, let me emphasize that I have no disagreement, and the learner would have had no disagreement that bad fiscal policy can have bad effects. And bad fiscal policy can take the form of an excessive stimulus and excessive deficits and excessive debt. Of course it can happen. That's one form of bad policy. Just like you have bad policies that have too little government spending and big recessions, and you don't do anything about it. So bad policy can do a lot of damage. But that's not what any Keynesian, Abel Lerner, or myself would advocate. Could there not be two-way causation? I'm going way too slowly. I'll have to I don't know. I'll have to cut some stuff. Could there not be be both causation? I've argued that in my model, and there might be good reasons to have causation running from growth to debt. But of course, that doesn't exclude that debt could also have harmful effects. And so one could consider that. And one way of having bad effects could be taxes and incentive effects. I don't find that convincing. And one reason is that, in fact, even the reduced form, remember taxes and debt are both endogenous variables in this setup. Right? Taxes are set by policymakers, and by setting taxes, they also influence the evolution of debt. So they're both endogenous. But if you look at the reduced form correlation, then it could actually go either way depending on what is the underlying exogenous change behind these movements in the two endogenous variables. So it's not even clear that high debt would be associated with high tax rates. And then, of course, if one looks at the importance of tax incentives, you had the period, the golden age in the American economy, with tax rates, marginal tax rates that were, by today's standards, sky high. And that was the high growth, the period with the highest growth rate in the U.S. Or you have evidence on the influence of incentives on labor force participation, where you have when you're on the axis here, you have an inverse measure of taxes. So the smaller the number, the less you get to keep, in a sense, if you work more. And what you find is that some of the countries up here have higher participation rates than the countries down here, despite what you should get if there were strong incentive effects of taxes on labor force supply. So this was an exercise so far in functional finance, but you could ask, is that relevant for anything? I mean, does that map into anything we see in the real world? And I would actually argue that although you don't have perfect functional finance, you clearly don't have. You had the austerity policy in the EU at a time when I thought it was an absolute disaster. So you don't always have it. But what you do have, I would argue, is a de facto kind of dirty, imperfect functional finance. Not surprisingly, if you go back in time to the period when Keynesian ideas were more dominant, then here's Tobin talking about how governments have reacted to recessions. And he was sort of complaining a little bit about the recent experience at this time when policy had not been the way it should be. But basically, during the Keynesian era, obviously, this was close to what governments were trying to do. But even if you look after that, the Bush tax cuts in the early 2000s, the Obama stimulus, what's happened during COVID-19, are examples of what is effectively when you get into situations with high unemployment, governments do tend to react despite everything else. The way they do it, Bush may have used the tax cuts to get stuff he wanted, lower taxes. Obama tried to do something slightly different. So the way fiscal policy is modeled may be slightly different, but it does respond. Even discretionary fiscal policy does respond to the state of the economy in a way that sort of is functional finances. And of course, you have automatic stabilizers that may be very strong in some countries, not quite as strong in others. So you could argue, or you could ask then, that is there any evidence to suggest strongly that there is not functional finance? And the most obvious evidence would be if we have governments that arbitrarily raise spending or reduce taxes and create deficits, then we would tend to get overheating. We would then tend to see monetary authorities, central banks responding. They would be responding by raising interest rates. And we should see a pattern where high debt as a result of this irresponsible fiscal behavior would be associated with high interest rates, which could crowd out investment, and that could be an important negative effect. But it would come via this link between debt and interest rates, right? That's the way you would see non-functional finance manifest itself. So here's for the U.S. on the horizontal axis. We have here we have the debt GDP ratio on the horizontal axis, and I took one particular interest rate. This here is the 3-month Treasury bill secondary market rate, and then I subtracted inflation rates from it. It's such a short period, but it's not too difficult to get a real rate of interest. And what you see is, if anything, you'll see, I won't draw the downward sloping line, but if anything, if there is any correlation, it would seem to be negative. High debt is correlated with low interest rates. So to argue that we have this crowding out and that the debt is really horrible because it leads to, it crowds out private investment, does not seem to have much support. That would actually support a kind of dirty functional finance. What would functional finance give you? Well, functional finance fixes the real rate of interest to get the appropriate choice of technique. And then you would get debt sort of varying. So with perfect functional finance and no use of monetary policy for short run stabilization, you should get just a horizontal line. If you have a little bit of sort of monetary stabilization, you may get sort of fluctuations around the line, pretty much what we see. So Summers rediscovered secular stagnation. The early one was in 2013, the speech at the IMF. But this here is a couple of years later, where he's a little bit more explicit, and he's talking about how we may need to find ways to increase demand to spend. And he's talking not cyclically. He's saying it's more of a secular problem. There's a rediscovery here that we may have longer term problems, but no real attempt to flesh out exactly what that might mean. And at this point, still, fiscal policy may be possible, but we have to worry we cannot expand the debt. Krugman also talked about, we have long-run budget problems back then. And then a couple of years later, in a paper with the co-author Rachel, he now, as the main finding, I think it's almost hilarious, he comes out and say the main finding of this paper is that now we see there's a dependence of the equilibrium real rate of interest on fiscal policy and public debt. How that could be news to anyone who is considered Keynesian is just a bit of a mystery to me. And the way they do it, I think, is the way they demonstrate that, and maybe that's their contribution, is in a way that I find somewhat uninteresting. It's basically an extension of the old diamond OLG model to multiple stages, not just 2 periods. Agents live for 60 periods or whatever it is, and that can give them more kind of detail. But that is a great depiction of modern economies, and the sources of stagnation in these economies is beyond me. Other people have used similar frameworks. I don't want to go into that. Let me spend just 1 minute on dual economies. Up until now, I've been talking about economies where you have an exogenously given growth rate. If you want to maintain full employment, you need to grow at a particular rate N. That is not the case in most developing economies. Most developing economies have a lot of underemployment. It's not that there's a labor supply constraint, so you can grow at N in steady growth. What you want to do is to get the investment capital ratio as high as possible. It's desirable to expand the modern sector more. You have a sectoral difference with a formal sector that's modern, high income, high productivity, and you have a lot of informal sector, very low productivity, very low income people. And you want to expand the modern sector. If you have excess saving, then try to feed it into investment. This is it. It's the structural transformation. And you don't want to just mop up demand or boost consumption if you have excess saving. You want to boost private and public investment, which can take different forms, and there are various complications here. Let me return to Japan. Japan during this period was a dual economy. There were no labor force constraints, and there was a lot of potential catch up in terms of technology. So they could achieve these. There were no aggregate demand problems because investment was a very large share of GDP. The high saving was channeled into investment. Then we had a period here with oil shocks, and gradually also Japan approached a mature economy. Growth rates dropped. They would have to drop when you get close to full employment. And you had tendencies to aggregate demand problems. They were masked by property booms in Tokyo, financial bubbles that for a while masked these, and then you get the collapse in 1990 when the property market, the real estate market collapsed. And since then, you've had this sort of stop-go limping growth. Saving rates were still high, and you now could not invest as much. So you had aggregate demand problems. How were they addressed? Well, there were limits to what they could do. They could not run foreign trade surpluses. That was not permissible by the Western countries, the US and others. So they were forced into some kind of fiscal policy, and so you got the debt GDP ratio rising dramatically during that period. Whenever there was a slight recovery, they tried to cut back because debt was bad, and then the economy dipped back again, and they then returned to expansionary policies. This rise in debt in itself was stimulating. Functional finance does not lead to an explosive debt that grows to infinity. It converges to some kind of level. So the increase in debt went some way towards addressing the aggregate demand problem. But of course, there also happened something else that may have been probably more important, or at least as important in the Japanese case, namely the demographic changes with the aging population now. So some of the people who were saving before now started spending their retirement savings. So we had this very dramatic fall in the private sector, in the household sector, saving out of disposable income. It went from about 20% to about 2%, 20% back in 1990 to about 2% recently. So that has sort of addressed the aggregate demand problems. But the only reason that Japan did not collapse was that these problems were addressed. Some of them, the demographics may have happened for demographic reasons, but some of it was the fiscal policy. The rise in debt was symptomatic of the lack of demand, which is the opposite of what a lot of people have claimed. Here's a quote from Obstfeld, who says, Japan's case illustrates how dangerous it can be to tolerate large debt buildups, putting exactly the wrong way, as far as I can tell. Debt was not the cause of stagnation. Debt was the symptom. As they came up against the maturity where they were close to full employment, they were hovering just below it, and you did not have a lot of catch up anymore. So there was not a lot of technical change, and you had a high saving rate. That's bound to lead to aggregate demand problems, and those were then partly solved through the expansionary fiscal policy. I won't go through this. Yeah. So this, to just briefly return to the title of my book, it's a structuralist story, which I think is important. I think economists often forget that not all economies are the same. The structuralist element here is the dual versus mature economy. That's too stark, but it's a better starting point than having just all economies being the same. And it's the matter of debt in own currency versus debt in a currency you don't control. These are very important distinctions. They're forgotten. And then the mature economy conclusion: you can have these structural long-run aggregate demand problems that call for long-run fiscal policies and may force you to allow debt ratios to increase. You should adjust your fiscal policy. Don't ask, is this or that exogenous path of primary deficit sustainable? That's a silly question. You should ask, what paths of debt and taxes should we choose so that we can maintain full employment and the optimal capital intensity? And of course, in any policy making, you may want to include other targets. These are the two traditionally mentioned, but you could have income distribution targets. You could have all kinds of other targets that would influence your choice of fiscal instruments. Debt implications, I think several of them are important. Low growth, high debt, that addresses a very prominent policy issue. And austerity policies, a reduction in G would actually lead to high debt if you want to maintain full employment. I am sorry I've spoken for so long. I didn't think it would take this long. Yeah, sorry about that. And thanks for listening.
Well, thank you very much, Peter.
Questions?
Okay, John, do you want to guide it? You had a question already in the middle. You want to repeat your question?
Well, I'm not sure I want to repeat it, but the problem is that capital stock is so difficult to even conceptualize because so much of it is intangible capital. So to standardize your equation on that is, to me, a problem, somewhat of a problem. The assumption of full employment is a terrific problem from the point of view of the United States, because the U.S., although you consider it a mature economy more or less, is a dual economy. There is a very full employment sector, yes. In the IT sector, the expanding finance sector is full employment. But at the same time, there are incredible pockets of unemployment. Well, I should say more than pockets, incredible amount of unemployment, people who are discouraged, who have gone into illegal activities. 2 million people are in jail. So it's very, very problematic to assume full employment. And thirdly, we're living in a globalized world. To devise a model that doesn't take that into consideration, when the U.S. imports 15% of its GDP, I think is very problematic. So, to me, secular stagnation means, something different. Since the U.S. is producing about $1 trillion less than potential. $1 trillion less than potential. So that gives us something to begin the discussion, I guess.
Peter, you want to respond?
Can I comment briefly, or shall we wait and take?
Well, I think you can respond immediately, you know. Also, the
let me
question, you know,
just.
Gregor has a question, but this might be completely different. You,
We could also take civil. That's fine. I'll make a note of. I'll come back.
Could I
mhm.
just add something, or is
Yeah, Ron, go ahead, please.
yeah? So I mean, it's very interesting subject, and I like what you did. But when I think about which economies are in stagnation, you know, the most obvious example to me is Britain, which seems to be, you know, you even had a prime minister there who, for 45 days, that basically the theme of her prime ministership was that the people didn't want to work in the country, they were too lazy and so on. And compared to even to the EU, which they left, uh, it's really a country that is not doing well. Japan, I've been to Japan quite a few times, and I hope to go again in a couple of months. And you know, in a way it stagnates, but it's extremely wealthy. And when you visit Japan, you just see how wealthy and well off they are, and they have a very good health system. It's kind of a different picture. And then, you know, one could go on about different countries. And the U.S., for all that John was saying about the U.S. nevertheless has fairly high growth compared to these other countries. So I don't see in your model and in this whole issue about secular stagnation, I don't see a key there as to why some countries are stagnating and other countries are not. And I don't think I agree with you about Reinhard Rogoff. You know, I don't think they lied, but it was certainly extremely controversial when that stuff came out, and immediately it was found out that the figures were all wrong and the conclusions were all wrong. And but in the meantime, the Republican politicians have picked it up. And then next week, you know, the U.S. could shut down. They could. It's easily possible to imagine that they won't be able to. That the extreme right in the Republican Party will not let them you know, raise the debt ceiling, and so the U.S. could default. I mean, so, but I don't. So the issues are fantastic, and there's a framework there. But what I would like to see is a kind of like a little key that says, this explains why some countries are doing well in these respects, and other countries are not.
Mhm. Yeah. Well,
Should I?
in fact, I would like to to respond to Ron, because we had in Germany, it looks for some people from outside, it looks pretty rich in a way. Uh, Probably not compared to Japan, but people from somewhere said, well, if you go to Germany, it's rich. The problem is just, you know, if you don't have growth and we can feel it, then you get a distribution problem. You know, I mean, you could say so stagnation doesn't matter, you know, but it has a lot to do with this called social peace, you know. If there's nothing, if there's no growth, the redistribution is going to be a little bit of a fight, you know. That's what we experience in Germany right now, actually, what I read. So this is because you said, well, stagnation is, it's not a bigger problem, you know.
So do you think Germany is stagnating, or it's not? I mean, to me,
Well,
Germany.
a growth rate of 1.9, you know, is not really exciting. But that's actually the data of this week, you know. This is really, I mean, this is now adjusted and all kinds. So we will have in the statistics 1.9. And then you could even argue, you know, what kind of tricks they have done to get 1.9. You know? But there's another story. But 1.9, it's you could say it's stagnating, isn't it? And the expectation is that next year it will not be better, you know. No, but others would say it's on a high level, yeah? But
It's
people are
much better
not
than
very.
Italy.
Hmm?
It's much better than Italy.
Mm-hmm.
The other country, Italy, looks with envy at Germany.
Mm. Yeah. But the Italians are privately very rich, aren't they? But of course, it's a counter argument to my argument.
Could I maybe
Yeah.
respond a little bit to some of this? Uh, I may
Let's go
may
back
not
to the
have
model.
been clear. Um, my topic is actually much narrower than
Yeah.
maybe it appeared. My issue was not really to explain growth rates per se. My issue was to explain why aggregate demand policy may sometimes be needed if we want to avoid a lot of unemployment. And that is, it sort of overlaps a little bit with the growth rate, but it's distinct. So I think if you have a what I would call a mature economy, then it's not really feasible to grow at 10% a year the way China did. You can say, okay, there are no labor constraints because you could allow people to immigrate freely, but politically that's a non-starter, right? I mean, that's not happening. You're not having 8% of the population being newly every year moving in to make up the labor shortfalls. I mean, that's not happening. So Japan could not continue growing at 8.2% a year in per capita terms forever. It wouldn't happen. I'm not really trying to explain what determines the long run growth rate once you're at full employment. I'm not trying to explain the rate of technical change, which is to some extent endogenous. I took it as exogenous here for simplicity.
But Peter, you keep
I'm
on
not
talking
trying to
about
explain.
you keep on talking about full employment, and it doesn't apply to the United Kingdom. It does not apply to the United States. There's no full
Okay,
employment.
okay. I will get to that. I'll get to that. Let me get to it now.
No, but you keep on coming back to it.
Yeah, no, let me explain what I have in mind. When I talk about a mature economy, then it is an economy that cannot grow at Chinese type 10% a year for more than at most a couple of years before you would get very big labor supply problems. And I think by
Nobody argues
that,
that. Nobody would argue that.
no, but China could do it for many years. There's nothing preventing India from doing that. There are no labor supply problems on the modern sector in India.
Well, it's not only a labor supply problem, it's also a problem of getting the technology from the West. They're not at the technological frontier. So that's not a big issue.
That's another big issue. But China grew at 10% a year. Korea grew at something not quite like that for a similar amount of years.
Nobody argues against
Those,
that.
no, but that is a very important distinction. That could not happen today in Germany or in Japan or in the US even. The US is a little bit more tricky. I think I hinted at that. I think the US has elements of a dual economy with very low productivity, poorly paid sectors. Uh, but
It is a dual economy. Let's put it that way, not elements. So
well, okay. You can say all countries are the same, right? Whether it's
no,
India or the
I'm
US
not
or
saying,
Japan, they're all kind of the
I'm
same.
not saying that. I'm saying it's
What?
still a dual economy. It's not like India, but it's a dual economy.
Okay. When you
Sorry,
I
but
have argued myself, and I stick with that full employment is a very poorly defined concept, and there's a lot of hidden unemployment also in the U.S. Whether it's 20% or 10% or 15%, we can debate. But it's not like India. It's not
Of course, of course,
70%. And
of
there's a
course.
qualitative difference. And I'm trying to capture that by saying the policy problem is different, which I think it is. And I think you can argue that some of the countries in the West have been moving around something that is within, say, within 20% of full employment, however we want to define it. And that those fluctuations within that band, and the fact that you fluctuate within that band, that's very different from countries that could grow for 30 years without coming close to exhaustion of the underemployment that exists in whether it's urban informal sectors, service sectors, or it's in agriculture. And the policy problems are different. Going back to some of the other questions that came up, I think if you talk about countries doing well, that is not just about fiscal policy. That's a very narrow element. I explicitly said I'm not going to discuss what should the government do. I did not discuss anything about social policies, welfare states. There's a whole range. I mean, I don't think GDP is a measure of welfare. I don't think that's is a country doing well. We're not just looking at GDP. We are looking at, Manfred talked about income distribution. We are looking at are people constantly worrying about losing their jobs, so they'll lose their healthcare and they'll go bankrupt, right? Absolutely sell their house. We are talking about a lot of other things that are not what I was discussing here. I was not discussing what is a good society and how should we get to it. I was discussing fiscal policy has a role in the short run, and I think that is de facto acknowledged. I was talking about how even people who maybe claim otherwise, when unemployment is high, we tend to see expansionary fiscal policy. So I think de facto there is this kind of dirty functional finance being implemented. And I was saying that extends not just to short run needs for fiscal policy, but also there may in some countries be a need for more persistent stimulus. And that persistent stimulus could lead to debt mounting to fairly high levels. I don't see any reason why it would have to explode and be without upper bound. But we may want to allow, we should follow fiscal policies that allow debt to go high. That, however, is not necessary and in fact would be harmful if you're talking India or Brazil. They don't need to stimulate consumption. If they have high savings, then you should feed them into trying to stimulate, and that also calls for intervention, but stimulate investment. Investment in the modern sector, in education, in infrastructure, in all kinds of ways. There's both private and public investment involved in this. I'm talking about fiscal policy, and I'm talking about fiscal policy which is about aggregate demand. Fiscal policy is about addressing aggregate demand. We're not talking about what should governments do to whether they should provide public education or free daycare or whatever, whether we should have a huge army. That's not fiscal policy, that's different things. I'm talking about aggregate demand policy.
No, but you were also talking about secular stagnation.
Yeah, okay, I'm sorry. And that secular stagnation in the original usage by Hansen back was about aggregate demand policy. And it was about the need for sustained stimulus. It is now being used partly by Robert Gordon and to some extent, I think also by Summers. He's not always, I think, completely clear. It's being used. I mean, Robert Gordon is talking about secular stagnation as just lower growth rates. And he's talking about supply side issues, about lower technical change and stuff like that. I mean, you can use terms the way you want. But that is not the way Hansen talked about it, and that is not what I'm talking about. However, there is a link. There is a link in the sense that the aggregate demand problems are more likely to appear. The sustained structural aggregate demand problems are more likely to appear if we don't need a lot of investment, right? Because if you don't need a lot of investment and we have a given saving rate, then we're going to have a problem. So when don't we need a lot of investment? Well, once we hit, I use it again, the term full employment, but I don't believe in a well-defined. I've written about hysteresis, I've written about a lot of stuff related to that. But once we have an economy that becomes mature, we cannot keep growing at 10% a year. So investment will have to come down. The investment output share in China is close to 50%. It would be crazy, I think, to have investment of that magnitude in Germany today. What would you feed it into? I mean, you build more factories and you don't have workers for them. Build more motorways. Build more. I mean, so once you hit maturity, once your supply side determined growth rate drops, then you can get aggregate demand problems. And you can address them in various ways. One way to address them that's not fiscal policy is if you could change income distribution, because if you change income distribution, you may also change consumption rates and patterns for that matter. I did not discuss that. I think income distribution is I mean, it's probably much more important. In fact, when you're talking welfare, I don't think high growth rates are particularly desirable. I don't see us getting happier or better or whatever just because income would go up. I mean, even Keynes talked about that, right? When he talked about his grandchildren back, and maybe that was. One could argue that some of the changes since then have been useful, but I'm not advocating growth as the solution. What I am saying, however, is that I think unemployment, which is a distributional problem. In fact, you have some people employed, some unemployed. That is important. We can talk about whether we should reduce working hours or have 4-day weeks or retire earlier or later or whatever. But to have some people forced into unemployment, that is bad. And I was talking about if that happens, if we have for aggregate demand problems, if that leads to that happening, then fiscal policy is a tool we can use, and we may need to use it both in the short run and the long run.
Yeah, but with aggregate demand policies, you will never get full employment in the United States because there is such a structural problem in skill mismatch, for example, and psychological, mental health problems. You're never going to get full employment with aggregate demands policies.
Okay, I mean, if I understand you correctly, if you say talk about mental health problems or whatever, then it seems you're defining full employment in some kind of. We would like to have people fit for work, and we need to address these social issues and these health issues, which is absolutely right.
Huh? Get them out of jail. Get them out of jail.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. But that's. Okay.
In other words, aggregate demand policies are not going to reach these folks. They're too.
No, of course not. Of course not.
So you know.
Aggregate demand policy does not solve everything. It's a very small tool. But
it's not working. In the meanwhile, the U.S. is going to the dogs.
I absolutely agree. I have no disagreement with that. But
most countries are going.
That does not mean we should not talk aggregate demand policy. Right now, we have crazy Republicans wanting to refuse to raise the debt ceiling in the U.S. because debt is so utterly important. Debt is devastating, and we are robbing our grandchildren and whatever they're saying, right? I think you can do a lot of damage with bad fiscal policy. I think Europeans did a lot of damage when they had the look at the Greek tragedy here. Look at this is GDP, okay, but you can also look at employment rates. Look at what happened here. GDP fell. This is a logarithmic scale, and it has not recovered. Look at unemployment rates here. Here's Greece, the blue, and Spain is not that much better. Germany has been doing quite well in terms of unemployment rates. It has been devastating consequences as a result of policies that were just misguided. Whether they were misguided entirely because people didn't understand economics or because they had other agendas. I mean, the Republicans may not believe debt is bad. They don't seem to believe it when they give tax reductions, tax cuts to the rich. But at least it's being used to justify policies that have been absolutely devastating in their consequences. What I'm talking about is a very narrow issue about the conduct of fiscal policy. That does not mean one shouldn't reform the criminal justice system in the US and release a lot of people who are being jailed for, I don't know, crazy numbers of years for possession of a bit of marijuana, right? I'm sorry.
No,
I sort of feel that maybe I should have emphasized the modest scope of what I'm doing. I don't think it's unimportant. I think it's very important, but obviously it's only one element. And social policies, distributional policies, labor market policies, the way you structure your tax rates, there are a ton of issues. I was thinking simply of, in this paper, I was talking only about managing aggregate demand. And what for a given tax structure and given decisions about what government should be doing, whatever, how that would feed into trajectories for tax rates and debt.
But
the
Peter,
open
you
economy
shouldn't.
issue came up. And,
Peter, you shouldn't be so modest on that. You shouldn't be so modest on it, on that, because if fiscal policy goes wrong, you know,
yeah,
I mean, well, fiscal policy is very abstract. People don't see fiscal policy, you know, but when these variables, so to say, you know, they interact in a way that is wrong, you know, then all the others, that's what I wanted when it comes to distribution, but that was not a wrong fiscal policy. That was my argument about stagnation, that stagnation can be a problem. It's not your point, your paper, you know, when I talked about distribution. I just said, you know, if you have this stagnation, then you need a lot of arguments, you know, to redistribute and do this and that, you know. Then it goes in structural policy, in social policy, and all kind of things. This was my illustration for stagnation. You start actually that there are mature countries, you know, which have stagnation, you know. Yeah. And then what to do then, you know? Then you gave conditions for that, you know.
No, I have no disagreement with that. I think yes, some of the distributional issues become more I don't know, more acute when you have stagnating economies, and I think they're always important, and I think in some ways they're much more important than the growth issues. But so I agree with you about that. Yeah, no, I mean, I guess I was just I guess I was feeling defensive. I felt I was being taken to task for not having addressed a lot of perhaps more important issues, which I haven't. And maybe I had led you to believe that I was going to address them, but I was not.
No, that was very interesting. I mean, that's what I said. Don't be modest. It's an important issue, fiscal policy.
I
And we
think it
have to
is.
learn a lot about that. I mean, I remember when I studied, I think we had half year. We studied fiscal policy. So it
Yeah,
seemed half year out of 4 years. It's a lot,
yeah,
isn't it? So even at that time, people, the professors thought it's an important issue.
mhm.
And I was asking a doctoral exam, what the color is the cover of Ben Tenson's book. Can you believe that?
What
What
color
is
is
the
what
cover of
cover?
the book?
What?
And the problem was I had the book from the library, so it didn't have an
You
original
didn't know.
cover. So I failed, no, not the exam, but this question. So we did all this, I mean, it was considered as important. And I still consider it as important. Okay?
It is important. Let me not suggest that I think it's unimportant, but it is just one element, and I think there are clearly many important issues that I have not touched upon that are important for the performance of economies and for the
Yeah.
welfare of people and so that's not what I was doing.
Yeah. But you make clear the mechanism, which brings this result. I mean, this very simple formal apparatus, and you see that's and you could show that many of the arguments, which are, so to say, in the space here, they're wrong, when you look at that, isn't it? They are not
Okay.
well funded. Okay.
Well, maybe a couple of more questions, and then we can thank Peter for his lively performance. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for your questions and yeah, for attending.
And stimulation, a little bit of stimulation.
A lot of stimulation. Yes, John. I'll have to. I'm not sure. I'm not sure we disagree that much, but maybe we do. But I think
Well, I think
I
there's a
certainly
little,
find
little bit, a little bit.
a little bit. A little bit of
Because
disagreement is good.
in terms of the how to apply the model to the Anglo-Saxon world, somebody brought up the United Kingdom. It's in big difficulties, and I think it has similarities to the United States,
Mm,
and it's something to think about.
yeah. Okay. I agree.
You
I
can't
agree. I
disagree
agree.
with that.
We'll leave it at that. Let's not keep it problem.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Take
Thank you
care.
very much.
Nice,
Thank you.
nice.
All right. Thanks very much.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye bye.